Now, just to be very, very clear about this, you can derive pleasure from good action. That is perfectly fine. In fact, it's part and parcel of doing this. So, in his less theoretical account of ethics, Kant talks about how pleasure is going to be a byproduct of performing one's duty in most cases. It's the only claim that he wants to make is that pleasure can't be the reason that you're doing it, because then you're doing it for the wrong reason. So consider these two scenarios to illustrate and sum up all of these things here. Suppose that I see a person struggling across the street. Suppose that I recognize a duty to help them. Say to myself, aha, I ought to help other people when I'm able, and I could easily carry that bag for that lady across this treacherous street. Let me assist her in compulsion with my moral duties. So I spring to her assistance. But of course, she's not expecting me to help her in these days and times. So rarely do people honor their duties with such enthusiasm as I am in this instance. And she tries to fight me off, and in the ensuing fight, she falls over and breaks her hip. Well, is my action in this case a moral action? Kant thinks, yeah, he does. He says, you were motivated in the right way. You felt the compulsion of duty. It motivated your action. It's not your fault, so to speak, that the consequences of the action are unfortunate. You can't be to blame for that. Your action was nonetheless a good action. So that's what I was just saying here. And in general, this is a theme of this section of Kant's argumentation. So, and this is going to be important later when we start to look at the utilitarians who think that the consequences do matter for an action. Kant's here making the argument that the consequences don't matter, that the only thing that matters is the motivation of one's action. Even if the consequences are bad, you still count as doing something good. And one large part of his argument is this central idea of his that the consequences of one's actions are out of one's control. So once you act, once it's out there, you don't know how things are going to go. They quickly become out of your reach, so to speak. So you say something, you do something, then this happens, and that happens, and that happens, and this happens, and very quickly it's no longer you who are in charge of what's going on. And Kant thinks that it's just sort of very, very odd that you could perform an action that's good or bad, but that isn't determined by something that is in you. That just seems very strange to him. And this is in general, I mean, think about this. It's something we'll talk about later, but just quickly, suppose that, you go to, you see a car coming and there's a person there and you push them out of the way, saving their life. You think that's good consequences, so that's a good action. Well, then what if this person was a mass murderer? So you just saved a mass murderer. They go on to kill their next victim. So now it's a bad action. Oh, but then you find out that their next victim was a person who had a nuclear device who was going to destroy New York City. So you really saved millions of people. So now it's a good action again. None of these things seem to be in your control. All that matters, or all that can really matter from your point of view, is why you do what you do. That's all you can really control. And if we're sort of judging whether you're good, seems like it should be because of something about you that makes you a good person and that makes your actions good actions. Consequences aren't in that arena. Now, of course, the utilitarians disagree, and we'll come to their arguments later towards the end of the semester. But just for now, this will be important for then, by the way, so you can come back to this point after our discussion of utilitarianism, and this will make a bit more sense. Okay, now, just to continue illustrating this point, suppose I see the same person. Okay, so suppose this elderly lady is crossing the street, hands full of packages. Now, Earlier, remember, I intended to help her out of a recognition of my duty to help. Suppose instead, this time, something different. I intend to cause her harm. I think to myself, aha, look at this old bat over here walking across the street. I'm going to have me a bit of fun, don't you know? And I'm going to run over there and push her over into the street. It's going to be hilarious. Her bags will go flying everywhere. She'll yelp in surprise, break her hip. Oh, it's going to be great fun. Now, suppose that in so doing, I accidentally, without meaning to, push her out of the way of an oncoming bus, saving her life. Did what I do count as morally good? Well, the consequences seem overall good. But Kant says my action itself, considered all by itself, chopping the consequences off, my action doesn't seem like a morally good action because I wasn't motivated in the right way. I intended to do harm. The good that resulted was accidental. I was merely trying to produce a certain feeling in myself, pleasure. That's what I was aiming for. And that I accidentally produced something desirable instead of undesirable is merely an accident of the universe. Now again, it doesn't seem like we should say that this person's action was good, Kant thinks, because if you just think about this person, they're not a good person. They're not doing something good. Sure, the consequences of it are good, but the action itself is not good. And this, again, you may disagree with Kant, and lots of people do. That's why the utilitarian theory of morality is going to be discussed next, because enough people disagree with Kant to think that it's worth trying to give a theory in more detail of what about consequences matter. So we'll turn to that later. But whether you agree with that or not, the point here is that for Kant, the consequences of an action are completely irrelevant to determining whether or not the action is moral. Now, of course, when I say completely irrelevant, we're gonna have to qualify that later, because thinking about consequences of actions do get to play some small role, but very, 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 very small. So we'll talk about that later. So again, just to stress, the only thing that matters for Kant is whether one is acting out of a recognition of one's duties. Okay, now of course, the question that you've probably had already by now is what are these duties? That's what's interesting. That's what we want to know. Sure, we can say, we have certain duties and so on, but what are they? Now, generally speaking, Kant says, duties are the kinds of things which are generated by laws. So, for instance, think about the laws of the state. Now, these aren't moral laws, they're legal laws, or in other words, they may in some sense try to capture things that we think of as moral or immoral, but oftentimes they don't. So take just a sort of banal, ordinary, average law like the speed limit on the freeway, 55 miles an hour, 65 in some places. Okay, so take the speed limit as being 65. Why is it that? Is it because it's immoral to drive faster? Well, no, actually, it turns out it has to do with conserving gas and miles per gallon and that kind of issue. So in some countries, famously, the speed limits are different. So in Germany on the Autobahn, there is no speed limit. You can go as fast as you want. And people tell horror stories about how fast it is. But of course, Germans don't tell horror stories. They tell horror stories about how slow Americans are and how they mess everything else up. We're just not used to driving at those speeds. But to focus back in on the issue here, because of the law to drive 65 miles an hour, we who drive have a duty to obey the law issued by the state, punishable by fines for those who do not fulfill their duty. So now think about those who drive on the highways. There are two ways of thinking about these people. There are those who drive the speed limit, if they do, because they are afraid of getting a ticket. These people, according to Kant, are not acting out of respect for the law, but are acting out of fear of the consequences of not following the law. That's very different. Now, there can be those kinds of persons who drive the speed limit because they recognize that they ought to. Now, I've never met such a person, but you can imagine somebody saying, well, the law says you drive 65, and I ought to obey the law. That's the law. Now, it doesn't seem as important with issues about the speed, but the point here is the one that's important. When you have laws, there are the kinds of people who respect those laws and whose actions are guided by the laws themselves because of a recognition of the nature of the law. And then there are those who obey the laws not because they care about the law, but only because of the consequences associated with violating the laws. Getting rewarded for following and punished for violating them. Now, as I was just mentioning, the speed limit doesn't seem to be a particularly moral issue, and the laws which govern it don't seem to be particularly moral laws. But the ones that Kant is interested in are the moral duties. And since every duty is generated by some kind of law, the moral duties are going to be generated by moral laws. But of course, the obvious question here